Constance Hargrove had spent 79 years believing that a life poured entirely into other people would leave at least one thing behind: the quiet, unshakable certainty that she was loved. She had raised 3 children with nothing but her own 2 hands, her seamstress income, and a faith that sacrifice was its own kind of inheritance. What she received instead, on an ordinary Tuesday morning in October, was an eviction notice slipped under her bedroom door by her own son, and 3 sets of eyes that couldn't hold her gaze long enough to feel the weight of what they were doing. Evicted at 79, with nothing but a worn suitcase and a dying promise her mother had whispered to her 44 years ago, Constance walked alone down a cracked road toward an old property on the edge of Dunmore Falls, Tennessee, a place her family had long dismissed as worthless and forgotten. But what waited for her in her mother Lillian's locked attic wasn't junk or dust or the hollow echo of a life already lived. It was something that would bring the most powerful and respected man in Dunmore Falls to his knees before the week was out, begging for forgiveness in front of everyone who had ever believed his lies. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Constance Connie Hargrove had lived in the small yellow house on Birchwood Lane for 21 years. It wasn't her house, had never technically been hers in the way that lawyers and deeds and property records understood ownership, but it had been her home in every way that actually mattered to a human being. She had scrubbed those floors and painted those baseboards and coaxed roses out of the stubborn clay soil in the backyard every spring. She had buried her husband Arthur from that house, had watched her grandchildren take their first steps on that worn hardwood floor, had spent 21 years paying rent on time every single month to an elderly landlord named Mr. Pershing, who had shaken her hand in 2003 and said, with the easy confidence of a man who expected to live forever, that she could stay as long as she needed to. He had meant it kindly. He had meant it genuinely. But Mr. Pershing had passed away the previous spring at the age of 88, and his son, a developer from Nashville who had visited Dunmore Falls exactly twice in the past decade, had inherited the property and wasted no time putting it on the market. Constance had no formal lease, just a handshake and 21 years of faithful payments and the kind of unwritten trust that existed between decent people, which turned out to mean absolutely nothing in a court of law. The new buyers had given her 60 days. Her children had given her excuses. Warren, her oldest at 55, had a 4-bedroom house in a quiet suburb of Knoxville. He had a home office he used twice a week and a guest room that hosted visitors roughly 4 times a year. When Constance had asked, carefully, gently, trying not to make him feel cornered, if she might stay just long enough to get on the waiting list for senior housing and find something suitable, he had exhaled the long, controlled breath of a man performing patience and told her that Linda, his wife, had certain boundaries around her personal space that he had to respect. He'd said it the way people say things they've rehearsed, the words smooth and practiced and completely without warmth. Diane, her 53-year-old daughter, had been softer about it, but no less firm. She traveled constantly for her job in corporate consulting, she explained. She was almost never home. Her apartment was small. The timing was genuinely terrible. She said this last part with a wince that might have been guilt or might have been irritation, and Constance could no longer tell the difference between the two on her daughter's face. Clifton, her youngest at 50, had simply stopped returning calls for 3 weeks after the eviction notice arrived, and then reappeared with a printout of 3 assisted living facilities within a 40-mile radius, all of which had waiting lists of 8 months to over a year. He'd set the papers on the kitchen table like he was presenting a business solution and said, "This is probably the most realistic path forward, Mom," as though she were a logistics problem that had finally been solved. She was not a logistics problem. She was her mother. She had worked 6 days a week for most of her adult life, taking in sewing and alterations. She had mended the clothes of half of Dunmore Falls while raising 3 children largely alone after Arthur's hours at the mill became erratic and his health began its slow, quiet decline. She had skipped dinners, skipped doctor's appointments, skipped every small comfort a person might allow themselves when money was tight, and money was always tight, so that Warren could have new shoes for school, so that Diane could go on the class trip to Washington, so that Clifton could take the driving lessons that cost $40 she didn't really have. She was not asking for gratitude. She had never asked for gratitude. She was asking for a room and a few months of patience while she figured out what came next. And all three of them had said no in their own particular ways, each refusal dressed up in the language of practicality, as though practicality were the same thing as decency. On the morning of October 14th, a Tuesday, she stood on the sidewalk in front of the yellow house on Birchwood Lane and watched Warren direct two men from a charitable donation organization as they loaded the last of her furniture and belongings into their truck. Not his truck, not a storage unit where things might be retrieved later. A donation truck, operated by strangers, whose job it was to sort through the remnants of her life and decide what had value and what should be discarded. Diane, who had been standing several feet away on her phone, lowered the device and walked over with an expression that managed to be simultaneously apologetic and impatient. "Mom, we can't solve all of this right now," standing on a sidewalk. "You have to start somewhere. You can't just stand here expecting things to work out." "I have somewhere to go," Constance said, the words arriving before she had fully decided to say them. "Your grandmother's old property. The main house is long gone, but the land is still in the family trust. There's a structure in the back, the attic room above the old carriage house. It's built into the hillside. I believe it's still standing." "I'm not suggesting anything," Constance said calmly, picking up her suitcase from the sidewalk. "I'm telling you where I'll be. If any of you ever decide you'd like to check on me, though I won't hold my breath waiting for that particular moment, that's where I'll be. Your grandmother's property, off Route 9, past the old grain mill." She did not look back as she walked away. She heard Warren say something to Diane in a low voice, the specific words unclear, but the tone unmistakable. The relieved, practical tone of people who have successfully handed off a difficult responsibility and can now return to their regular lives. She kept walking, her suitcase in her right hand and her coat buttoned against the October chill, each step carrying her further from the children who had failed her and closer to the promise her mother had made 44 years ago on the last night of her life. "When the day comes that you have nowhere left to turn, go to the attic, Connie. I left something there for you. I left something that will matter. Promise me you'll remember." Constance had promised, holding Lillian's papery hand in the dim light of the hospital room, believing with the gentle condescension of a middle-aged daughter that her mother was simply afraid of dying and needed to feel that she was leaving something behind. She had promised, and then, for 44 years, had carried the memory of that promise the way you carry something you don't fully believe you'll ever need. Lightly, almost carelessly, tucked somewhere in the back of your mind beneath all the more pressing concerns of living. She was 79 years old, walking alone down a cracked Tennessee road in October, and she was finally going to find out what Lillian Hargrove had meant. The road out to Lillian Hargrove's old property ran northeast from the center of Dunmore Falls, winding past the grain mill that had closed in 1987, past the collapsed fence line of what had once been the Alderman farm, past a stretch of old-growth oak and sweet gum trees that had never been cleared because nobody had ever found a profitable reason to clear them. Constance knew this road the way she knew the pattern of her own breathing, not because she had walked it recently, but because roads learned in childhood stay in the body long after the mind has moved on to other things. She had ridden this road on her bicycle as a girl, had walked it as a teenager on summer evenings when the air smelled of honeysuckle and cut grass, had driven it in her 20s and 30s when Lillian was still alive and the house at the end of it was still standing and lit from within and full of the particular warmth that only exists in a home where someone is genuinely glad you arrived. The house itself had burned down 11 years ago. An electrical fault in the old wiring, the fire marshal had said, the kind of deterioration that happens slowly and invisibly inside walls until it doesn't. By the time a neighbor spotted the smoke from half a mile away, the main structure was already beyond saving. The insurance settlement had been modest. Lillian had been gone for years by then, and the property had been sitting in the family trust, technically belonging to all of her descendants in equal and complicated shares, practically belonging to no one because no one had taken responsibility for it. The insurance money had been divided and distributed. Constance's share had gone to a dental bill and 2 months of Arthur's medication. The land had simply remained, quietly accumulating property taxes that the trust paid automatically from a dwindling account, slowly being reclaimed by the Tennessee hillside that had always seemed vaguely impatient with the idea of human settlement. What had not burned, because it was entirely separate from the main house and set back into the slope of the hill behind where the house had stood, was the carriage house. It was a structure that dated to the early 1920s, built by Constance's grandfather, Edmund Hargrove, from local limestone and heavy-cut timber, designed with the solid, unornamented practicality of a man who built things to last and had no patience for decoration. The ground floor had housed Edmund's tools and, for a brief period, an actual horse and carriage before automobiles made both unnecessary. The upper level, accessed by an exterior staircase on the east side of the building and sealed with a heavy door that Lillian had fitted with a good padlock sometime in the 1970s, was what the family had always called the attic room, though it was less an attic in the traditional sense and more a full second floor that happened to be used for storage. Lillian had used it as her private space. Her sanctuary, she called it, in those later years when the word had taken on a particular weight and frequency that Constance had noticed but never fully understood at the time. She had gone up there alone in the evenings sometimes, especially in the years after Edmund died, and she would come back down quieter but somehow more settled, as though she had gone up with something unresolved and come down with it sorted. Constance had asked about it once, as a teenager, and Lillian had said simply, "There are things up there that matter, Connie. Things that are mine. That's enough for you to know right now." She had not asked again. The walk from Birchwood Lane to the old property took Constance just under 2 hours at the careful pace her arthritic knees required. She stopped once at a gas station on Route 9 to fill a 2-liter water jug she'd packed in her suitcase and to sit for 10 minutes on a concrete curb outside the entrance, resting her feet and eating the last of a sleeve of crackers she'd brought. The young man at the register had looked at her age, at her suitcase, at the deliberate way she moved, with a particular mixture of curiosity and discomfort that people display when they encounter something that doesn't fit neatly into their understanding of how the world is supposed to work. She had thanked him for the water and kept walking. She turned off Route 9 onto the old gravel access road at noon. The gravel had mostly disappeared under years of encroaching vegetation, but the packed earth beneath it still held the shape of the road, and Constance followed it through the tree line and up the gradual rise toward where the house had been. She had not been here in 9 years, not since a brief visit with Arthur shortly before his diagnosis, and the transformation that a decade of uninterrupted nature could accomplish still managed to surprise her. The old garden beds were completely overtaken. The stone walkway that had led from the road to the front door was invisible beneath layers of leaf debris and low-growing moss. The concrete foundation of the main house was still visible in outline, its edges softened by weeds and by 2 young sassafras trees that had established themselves in opposite corners with the cheerful indifference of things that don't know they're growing in the wrong place. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But beyond the foundation, set back against the hillside exactly as she remembered, the carriage house stood. Its limestone walls had weathered to a deeper gray over the years, stained in long vertical streaks by decades of rain, and the timber framing above the ground floor door had sagged slightly to one side, but the structure itself was fundamentally intact. The exterior staircase on the east side was still there, its wooden treads worn smooth and darkened by weather, but solid when she tested the first step with her full weight. The upper door was closed, fitted with a heavy padlock that had oxidized to a deep reddish brown. Impressed into the keyhole cover, barely visible beneath the rust and grime, was a decorative stamp in the shape of a small flower. A violet, Lillian's favorite, that Constance recognized immediately as the mark of the locksmith her mother had always used. She set her suitcase down at the foot of the stairs and reached into the interior pocket of her coat, where she had kept, for 44 years, a small brass key on a worn cotton ribbon. Lillian had pressed it into her palm in the hospital room on the last night of her life, closing Constance's fingers around it with a grip that was surprisingly firm for someone so diminished by illness, and said the words that Constance had carried ever since like a stone in her pocket. present always, weight never quite forgotten. For the attic, Connie, when you have nothing left and nowhere to go, promise me. Constance stood at the foot of those weathered stairs in the October afternoon light, 79 years old, homeless and cold, and more alone than she had been at any point in her adult life. And she felt, beneath all of that, something she could not quite name yet. Not hope exactly. Something older than hope. Something closer to the feeling of a door about to open that has been shut for a very long time. She began to climb. The stairs held her weight on every step, which was more than Constance had allowed herself to expect. The wood groaned in places, settling under her, with the particular complaint of old timber that has been asked to be useful again after a long period of being left alone, but nothing shifted or cracked or gave way beneath her. She climbed slowly, one hand on the iron railing that Edmund Hargrove had bolted to the limestone wall of the carriage house all those decades ago, her suitcase left at the bottom, her coat pulled close against the October wind that moved through the tree line with a low, persistent sound like something breathing. At the top of the stairs, she stopped and looked at the door. It was heavier than she remembered, or perhaps she was simply older, or perhaps both things were true simultaneously in the way that most honest observations about aging tend to be. The door was solid oak, weathered to a pale silver gray, its surface cracked in long vertical lines where the wood had dried and split over the years, but had never actually failed. The padlock hung from a heavy iron latch, thickly coated in rust, looking as though it had not been touched since Lillian herself had last turned a key in it. Constance did not know exactly when that had been. She only knew it had been a very long time. She held the small brass key up in the afternoon light for a moment, studying it. 44 years she had carried this key. Through 3 different apartments and the yellow house on Birchwood Lane. Through Arthur's illness and his death and the long, colorless years of managing grief while still managing everything else. Through the slow, incremental erosion of her children's attention and the growing suspicion, never quite acknowledged until now, that she had somehow become inconvenient to the people she had loved most completely. Through all of it, this key had been in her coat pocket or her jewelry box or her bedside drawer, present and unremarkable, a small brass fact she had never known what to do with. She fitted it into the padlock. It did not turn easily. Decades of oxidation had thickened the internal mechanism, and Constance had to apply steady, firm pressure, using both hands, her fingers white with effort, before she felt the first grudging movement inside the lock. She pressed harder, twisting with everything her hands still had, and with a grinding shriek of metal that startled a pair of birds out of the oak tree beside the carriage house, the padlock released. She unhooked it from the latch and set it carefully on the top step beside her. Then she gripped the door handle, iron cold, rough with rust, and pulled. The door resisted with the full force of 11 years of swollen wood and settled framing. Constance braced her feet against the top step and pulled with both hands, leaning her weight back, and the door fought her for a long moment before it gave suddenly and completely, swinging open with a sound like tearing cloth and releasing a rush of air that had been sealed inside for longer than Constance could calculate. The smell of it hit her immediately and stopped her completely. Lavender, old paper, cedarwood, and beneath all of that, faint but unmistakable, the specific smell of her mother's house. That combination of beeswax and wool and something warm and indefinable that Constance had not encountered in 11 years, and that struck her now with a physical force entirely disproportionate to its gentleness. It was the smell of being 7 years old and coming in from the cold. It was the smell of safety before she had learned that safety was not guaranteed. She stood in the doorway for a moment, blinking, letting her eyes adjust from the bright October afternoon to the dim interior. Then she reached into her coat pocket, found the small flashlight she had packed with the instinct of someone who had learned to prepare for practical difficulties, clicked it on, and stepped inside. The attic room was larger than the carriage house looked from the outside, its floor plan extending back into the hillside in a way that the exterior gave no indication of. The ceiling was low but not oppressively so, following the line of the roof in a gentle slope from the doorway in down toward the back wall. The floor was wide plank oak, dusty and scattered with the dried remnants of old lavender sachets that had long since given up most of their scent, but had apparently surrendered it slowly enough that something of it still lingered in the sealed air. Shelves ran along both side walls, built directly into the framing, holding a careful and deliberate arrangement of objects: folded linens, old books with cracked spines, mason jars of buttons and spools, a ceramic lamp base without its shade, a wooden box of sewing tools that Constance recognized immediately as belonging to her grandmother before Lillian had inherited them. And at the back of the room, positioned against the rear wall with the careful intention of something placed rather than stored, was a trunk. It was not large, perhaps 3 feet wide and 2 feet deep, but it was solidly built, dark walnut with brass corner fittings that had gone green with age, and it sat on 2 wooden blocks that kept it off the floor in the way that someone who understood moisture and would have arranged it deliberately. A length of oilcloth had been draped over the top and tucked carefully around the sides, and when Constance peeled it back, the wood beneath was in remarkable condition, barely weathered, almost warm-looking in the beam of her flashlight. The trunk was sealed with dark red wax, applied in a thick continuous bead around the entire seam where the lid met the body, pressed and smoothed by hand so that the seal was complete and unbroken. And into the wax, at the center front where the latch would have been, a stamp had been pressed before the wax hardened. A small oval cameo depicting a woman in profile, which Constance recognized without any possibility of doubt as the brooch Lillian Hargrove had worn on the collar of her good dress every Sunday for as long as Constance could remember. The brooch she had been buried without, because someone had quietly removed it beforehand and brought it here. This was not an accident or an afterthought. This was deliberate. This was a woman who had known exactly what she was doing and had taken considerable care to do it properly. Constance knelt on the dusty floor in front of the trunk, her knees protesting, her flashlight balanced on the shelf behind her to illuminate the scene. She reached into her coat pocket and withdrew the small sewing kit she had packed from habit and decades of professional reflex: thread, needles, a pair of sharp embroidery scissors. With the scissors, working slowly and carefully, she broke the wax seal in sections, running the blade gently along the bead until the entire seam came free without damage to the wood beneath. She pressed her palms flat against the lid. She felt the particular stillness of a moment that knows itself to be significant. And she opened it. The smell of lavender rose up immediately, fresh and concentrated from sachets tucked into every corner of the interior, sachets that had been sealed inside long enough to retain almost their full potency. Beneath the smell, visible in neat layers through several sheets of thin tissue paper, was fabric. Ivory fabric. Silk, from the way it caught the flashlight beam. And beneath the tissue paper, when Constance lifted it aside with hands that had begun to tremble without her having made any decision to tremble, was a dress. Not just any dress. Constance knew this dress. She knew its construction and its cut and the particular pattern of the lace at the collar because she had spent 3 weeks making it with her own hands in the spring of 1979, pouring into every stitch the hope of a woman who had been given, against all reasonable expectation, a second chance at happiness. It was the dress she had made for the wedding that never happened. The dress she had last seen 44 years ago, on the night everything fell apart. The dress she had assumed was long gone, lost or destroyed or discarded in the chaos of that terrible week, when Alderman Raymond Stokes had stood up in front of the Dunmore Falls Community Council and told a lie so deliberate and so complete that it had taken her entire life away in the space of an afternoon. She sat back on her heels, unable to breathe, staring at the dress that should not exist, that her mother had somehow found and preserved and hidden here with the careful, patient love of someone who had never stopped believing that truth would eventually matter. Beneath the dress, she could already see the edges of envelopes. Several of them, old and yellowed, addressed in handwriting she did not yet recognize. Her hand was shaking badly now. She reached in and picked up the first one. The envelope sat in Constance's hands unread for a long moment, while the memories she had spent 44 years deliberately not examining came back to her with the unstoppable force of water through a broken dam. She had been good at not examining them. She had developed, over the decades, a precise and practiced ability to redirect her attention the moment her mind moved toward that particular corridor of the past, to focus instead on the hem she was finishing, the invoice she needed to write, the grocery list, the weather, anything concrete and present that could serve as a wall between her and the memory of what Raymond Stokes had done to her in the spring of 1979. But sitting here on the dusty floor of her mother's attic with the dress in the trunk before her and the envelope in her hands, she found that the wall had simply dissolved. There was nothing left to redirect toward. There was only the memory arriving in full, and the 59-year-old woman it had happened to, and the 79-year-old woman sitting here now, who had never fully stopped being her. She had been 35 years old in the spring of 1979. A seamstress with a small but growing alterations business operating out of the front room of her rented house on Caldwell Street, 2 blocks from the center of Dunmore Falls. She had moved to Dunmore Falls 4 years earlier from Knoxville, following a brief and unhappy first marriage that had ended without children and without drama, but with the particular quiet devastation of realizing you had chosen entirely the wrong person and spent 3 years trying to make that fact untrue through sheer effort of will. She had arrived in Dunmore Falls with her sewing machine, her tools, her professional reputation, and a deliberate intention to build something new and solid that belonged entirely to herself. In late March, he had come to the shop after closing hours. She had still been inside, finishing a bridesmaid dress that was needed the following morning. When she opened the door to his knock, not having yet learned to check who was there before opening, he had stepped inside with the ease of a man who had not considered the possibility of being turned away, and had said things to her, plainly, directly, with a confidence that was more frightening than aggression would have been, that made it unmistakably clear what he wanted and what he believed she should be grateful to be offered. Constance had told him no, clearly, firmly, without ambiguity or softening. She had told him that she was not interested, that his visits needed to stop, that she expected him to leave immediately and not return. She had kept her voice steady through the entire speech, through the kind of concentrated effort that leaves a person shaking badly the moment the threat has actually gone. He had looked at her for a long moment with an expression she had no name for at the time, but that she had spent 44 years subsequently identifying and re-identifying with the precision of someone who needed to understand exactly what she had seen. It was not anger, not exactly. It was something colder than anger. It was the expression of a man recalculating, deciding, choosing his next move with the detached efficiency of someone for whom other people's lives were simply variables in an equation about his own interests. He had left without another word. 2 weeks later, Alderman Raymond Stokes had requested an emergency closed session with the full Dunmore Falls Town Council and 3 prominent community leaders, and had told them, with apparent reluctance and evident distress, that Constance Hargrove had been making inappropriate advances toward him for several weeks, that she had come to his office at Town Hall and propositioned him explicitly, that she had made suggestions that deeply disturbed him, and that he felt, as a public servant and a family man, a duty to bring forward before the situation escalated further. He had said all of this with the careful, wounded dignity of a man being forced by conscience to do something painful, and every person in that room had believed him without reservation. Why would they not? He was Raymond Stokes. He sat on the town council. He attended First Methodist every Sunday with his wife Margaret and their 2 daughters. He coached youth baseball. He was, by every available measure that Dunmore Falls used to assess a person's credibility and character, entirely trustworthy. And Constance Hargrove was a divorced woman from out of town who lived alone and whose history nobody in Dunmore Falls knew well enough to defend. Within 48 hours, the story had moved through the town with the efficient, merciless speed that damaging gossip achieves in small communities. Constance lost 4 clients in the first week. By the end of the second week, she had lost 11. Women who had praised her work and recommended her to their friends stopped returning her calls. A woman she had considered a genuine friend crossed the street rather than pass her on the sidewalk. The owner of the dry goods store where she bought her materials began watching her with open suspicion whenever she came in, as though she might steal something. It was in the middle of this collapse that she had met Arthur Hargrove. He had come to her shop, which was by then barely functioning, with a coat that needed its buttons replaced, a simple job that he could have taken anywhere, and Constance had always suspected afterward that he had come specifically because he had heard the rumors and wanted to see for himself whether the woman at the center of them seemed like the woman the rumors described. He had stayed for 2 hours, talking, listening, asking questions with the genuine curiosity of someone who understood that most stories had more than one version and that the official version was frequently the least accurate one. They had married quietly at the county courthouse 14 months later. Constance had made her own wedding dress, ivory silk with lace at the collar and cuffs, pouring into it every ounce of hope she could still locate in herself after a year of being treated as though she were contaminated. She had made it believing that the wedding would restore something, would mark a real beginning, would give her back a version of herself she had nearly lost entirely. 3 weeks before the wedding, Raymond Stokes had found out about it, and he had made sure it didn't happen. Constance sat with the first envelope in her hands for a long moment before she opened it. The return address had been scratched out with deliberate care, as though the writer had considered and reconsidered the risk of identification right up until the final moment of sealing the envelope. The postmark read July 1979, 2 months after the council session that had destroyed her reputation, and 3 weeks after the quiet courthouse wedding that Raymond Stokes had attempted to prevent through a second, more targeted round of rumors that had thankfully failed to reach Arthur in time. The handwriting on the front was small and careful, the letters formed with the precise control of someone who was afraid of being recognized, even in their penmanship. She unfolded the single sheet inside and began to read. Dear Mrs. Lillian Hargrove, I am writing this letter because I cannot continue to carry what I know in silence. Even though I am far too frightened to say these things anywhere they might actually be heard or acted upon. I have no way of knowing whether this letter will reach you, or whether it will matter if it does. But I cannot simply do nothing, and this is the only thing I am brave enough to do. My name is Vera Hutchins. I worked as a clerk and administrative assistant in the Dunmore Falls Town Hall for 9 years, including the years when Alderman Raymond Stokes served on the council. I managed his correspondence, his scheduling, and his office records. I was present in the building on the afternoon of March 28, 1979, when Alderman Stokes claims that Constance Hargrove came to his office and behaved inappropriately toward him. I know with complete certainty that this did not happen. Not because I was inside the office, but because I scheduled every appointment that came through that office, and Constance Hargrove had no appointment on that afternoon. Furthermore, I was at my desk outside his office for the entirety of that afternoon, and no woman matching her description came to see him. No one came to see him at all between 2 o'clock and 5. I have the scheduling records to confirm this. What I also know is that Alderman Stokes left the building at approximately 4:30 that afternoon and returned 40 minutes later in a state of visible agitation that I noticed because I had worked with him long enough to recognize when something had unsettled him. He went directly in his office and closed the door. Approximately 20 minutes later, he emerged with a composed expression that I recognized as the expression he wore when he had made a decision he felt settled about. This one was not anonymous. The name on the return address was written clearly in the decisive hand of someone who had decided that if they were going to do this at all, they would do it without the cowardice of anonymity, even if they lacked the deeper courage of public testimony. Bernard Okafor. Constance recognized the name immediately. He had owned a hardware supply shop on the east side of Dunmore Falls for many years before relocating his business to a larger town. He had been a respected figure, known for fairness and directness, the kind of man whose opinion carried weight precisely because he offered it rarely. She had bought supplies from his shop twice. They had exchanged perhaps 40 words total in their lives. The postmark read September 1979. Dear Mrs. Hargrove, I am writing to you because I witnessed something in the spring of this year that I have not been able to stop thinking about, and because staying silent about it feels increasingly like a form of participation in something unjust. On the evening of Thursday, March 22nd, I was closing my shop later than usual due to a delivery that had arrived after hours. At approximately 6:30, I was locking the rear entrance of my building, which faces the small parking area behind a row of shops on Caldwell Street. Your daughter's alterations business occupied the front room of the building directly across from mine. I witnessed Alderman Raymond Stokes knock on the rear door of that building and be admitted. I thought nothing of it at the time. I assumed it was a business matter of some kind. Approximately 20 minutes later, I was still in my stockroom, completing inventory, when I heard raised voices. Not clearly enough to distinguish words, but clearly enough to understand that a disagreement was occurring. Shortly afterward, I heard a door open and close firmly, and when I looked through my rear window, I saw Alderman Stokes walking away across the parking area with the rapid, rigid stride of a man who was controlling his anger with effort. I did not understand the significance of what I had witnessed until the council session 2 weeks later, when he made his accusations against your daughter. I understood then, with absolute clarity, what I had seen. He had gone to her. She had refused him. He had left angry. Everything that followed was his retaliation. I wanted to come forward immediately. I discussed it with my wife at length. My wife reminded me that we have 2 outstanding contracts with businesses whose owners are close personal friends of Alderman Stokes, and that speaking publicly against him would almost certainly cost us those contracts and possibly others. We have employees who depend on that income. I made the decision that I am not proud of and have not stopped regretting. I am sending this letter to you because I was told by a mutual acquaintance that you are a woman of discretion and integrity who is trying to protect your daughter. I hope this account of what I witnessed is useful to you in some way, even if I am too much of a coward to say it where it would actually matter. I am sorry, Mrs. Hargrove. Your daughter deserved better than what this town did to her. She deserved better than what I did, which was nothing. Bernard Okafor. Constance folded the second letter and set it beside the first. 2 witnesses. 2 people who had seen pieces of the truth and documented them carefully and sent them to her mother because they could not stay entirely silent and could not find the courage to be entirely loud. She understood them. She could not forgive them. Not fully, not yet, but she understood them. Fear was not an excuse, but it was a reality, and she had lived long enough to know that most people, when forced to choose between justice for a stranger and security for their children, chose their children. She would perhaps have done the same. She reached for the 3rd envelope. Constance spent that night in the attic room, wrapped in 2 old wool blankets she found folded on the bottom shelf. The trunk open beside her, the letters and the dress within reach. She did not sleep much. She did not try particularly hard to sleep. She lay in the darkness and thought with the focused clarity of someone who has passed through the far side of grief and arrived at something harder and cleaner. And by the time the gray light of early morning began to show at the single small window in the east wall, she knew exactly what she was going to do and exactly how she was going to do it. Raymond Stokes, she had learned from the occasional fragments of Dunmore Falls news that reached even her isolated life, was 88 years old now and still lived in the town. He had retired from the council 20 years earlier, but retained the particular social permanence of a man who had been significant for long enough that the town had simply absorbed his significance as a permanent feature of its identity. He still attended the monthly Dunmore Falls Community Founders Breakfast, held on the first Saturday of every month at the Community Hall on Main Street. A public event, open to all residents, attended by approximately 150 people drawn from every part of Dunmore Falls society. The first Saturday of October was in 2 days. Constance had 2 days to prepare. She had the letters, carefully folded and placed in the interior pocket of her coat. She had the dress, which she examined in the morning light with her seamstress's eye and found to be in extraordinary condition, preserved by the lavender and the sealed trunk and her mother's meticulous care. She had her sewing kit. She had her scissors. She had 44 years of accumulated patience that had finally, completely run out. She looked at the dress for a long moment. Then she began to work. She worked through the morning and into the afternoon with the focused precision of someone returning to the thing they have always done best. She removed the train, shortening the back to a practical walking length. She adjusted the neckline, changing its romantic softness into something more structured and intentional. She found a dark wool shawl in her suitcase and modified it into a wrap that gave the entire ensemble a dignity that was less bridal and more declarative. When she finally stood and assessed what she had made, in the small, compact mirror she'd packed, she saw someone she recognized from a long time ago. Not a defeated woman, not a homeless woman, not a woman whose children had laughed at her descent into a basement and walked away relieved. A woman who had something important to say and intended to be heard saying it. She rose before dawn on Saturday morning, dressed carefully, pinned her white hair into the neat and elegant style she had worn for important occasions throughout her adult life. And at 7:30 in the morning, she walked out of the attic room and down the weathered stairs into the cool October air and turned toward Dunmore Falls. He saw her when she was 15 feet away. She watched his face move through several expressions in rapid succession: confusion, recognition, and then, unmistakably, fear. He knew the dress, or he knew what it represented, or he simply recognized, in the specific quality of her approach, that something was about to happen that his 44 years of comfortable impunity had not prepared him for. She stopped directly in front of him. The conversations nearby had gone quiet. The quiet was spreading outward through the room like something physical. "Raymond Stokes," Constance said, and her voice was steady and clear and entirely without the trembling she might have expected after 44 years of silence. "I have something that belongs to the truth, and I intend to give it back right now, in front of everyone in this room." She reached in her coat and withdrew the 3 letters. The room was completely silent. 44 years ago," she said, "you stood in front of the people of this town and told a lie that took everything from me. You told them I had pursued you. You told them I had behaved inappropriately. You told them I was a woman of poor character who deserved to be treated as one." She paused, letting the words settle. "You lied. You pursued me. You came to my business after hours. You made propositions I rejected clearly and repeatedly. And when I refused you, you decided that if you could not have what you wanted, you would make sure I had nothing at all." Stokes opened his mouth. His face had gone the color of old ash. "I have a letter," Constance continued, holding up the first envelope, "from Vera Hutchins, who worked in your office and knew your scheduling records and knows that everything you claimed happened in your office on March 28th, 1979 is a fabrication. I have a letter from Bernard Okafor, who witnessed you coming to my business uninvited on the evening of March 22nd and leaving angry when I turned you away. And I have a letter from my mother, who can tell this entire room exactly how you came to her house and threatened her into silence when she tried to bring this evidence forward." She looked around at the faces surrounding her. Shock, discomfort, the beginning of something that looked like genuine reckoning. "I'm not asking you to take my word over his," she said. "I have never asked anyone to simply take my word. I'm asking you to look at documented evidence from multiple witnesses and decide what the truth is. Something this town failed to do 44 years ago because it was easier to believe a powerful man than an inconvenient woman." She turned back to Stokes. His coffee cup was in his hand, and his hand was shaking. "Did you lie about me?" she asked quietly. "Did you pursue me and lie about it when I refused you? Yes or no?" The silence was absolute. Somewhere at the back of the room, someone had their phone raised. The room waited. Raymond Stokes looked at the letters, looked at the room, looked at the woman standing in front of him in the dress she had made for a wedding he had stolen, and something in him that had been held rigid for 44 years simply gave way. "Yes," he said. His voice was barely audible. Then, louder, cracking, "Yes. I lied. I lied about all of it. I pursued her, and she refused me, and I couldn't let her. I lied. God forgive me, I lied." The room erupted. The video appeared online before Constance had walked halfway back to the old property. Someone in the community hall had recorded the entire confrontation on their phone and posted it to a local Facebook group within minutes of it ending. And from there it had moved with the frictionless, accelerating momentum that social media gave to stories that struck a particular nerve in people. By the time Constance reached the carriage house and climbed the weathered stairs back to the attic room, the video had been shared 400 times. By evening, it had crossed into regional news feeds. By the following morning, it had gone fully national. The headlines arrived in waves. 79-year-old woman confronts official who destroyed her life 44 years ago. Elderly seamstress presents hidden letters proving decades-old lie. Tennessee alderman admits fabricating accusations against innocent woman after nearly half a century. Each headline found a slightly different angle on the same essential story, but they all contained the same core elements that had apparently resonated with an enormous number of people who had never heard of Dunmore Falls, Tennessee, and did not need to have heard of it to understand exactly what had happened there. By Monday morning, 2 television news crews had located Constance at Lillian's property. She let them come. She sat on the wooden steps of the carriage house in the October sunshine and spoke to their cameras with the same steady clarity she had used in the community hall, and she made sure they understood not just what Raymond Stokes had done 44 years ago, but what her children had done 2 weeks ago. She described the eviction notice slipped under her door. She described the donation truck carrying away her belongings. She described Warren's practiced flatness and Diane's impatient apology and Clifton's printout of assisted living facilities presented like a business solution. She described walking away from her home of 21 years with a single suitcase and spending her first night in an attic that had no power and no running water, because the alternative was having nowhere at all. The response to this part of the story was, if anything, more intense than the response to the confrontation itself. People were outraged on her behalf in the particular way that stories about elderly parents abandoned by their children generate outrage. A combination of genuine moral indignation and personal fear, the recognition that this was not an abstract injustice, but a specific and entirely possible one. Her story was shared in parenting groups and senior advocacy forums and general news feeds by people who wanted to make sure everyone they knew had seen it. A retired schoolteacher in Nashville wrote a long post about it that was shared 40,000 times in 24 hours. Raymond Stokes issued a written statement through a lawyer on Monday afternoon acknowledging that his 1979 accusations against Constance Hargrove had been false and expressing what the statement called profound remorse. The statement was careful and legal in its language, clearly written to minimize liability rather than genuinely reckon with what he had done, and people noticed. The response to the statement was substantially more negative than the response would have been to silence. 2 community organizations he had been associated with for decades requested his resignation from their boards before the week was out. The Dunmore Falls Town Council issued a formal public statement on Tuesday acknowledging that the 1979 proceedings against Constance Hargrove had been conducted without adequate scrutiny of the evidence presented and expressing the council's regret for the impact on her life and reputation. It was the careful, institutionally defensive language of a body trying to acknowledge wrongdoing without accepting legal liability, but it was public and it was on record, and it was more than Constance had ever expected to receive from any official body in her lifetime. Her children came on Wednesday, all 3 of them together, which told her they had coordinated beforehand, had rehearsed at least some of what they were going to say. Warren arrived first and held the door for Diane and Clifton, and then stood in the entrance of the attic room looking at the space, the trunk, the dress, the folded blankets, the flashlight, with an expression that moved through several stages of understanding in the span of a few seconds. "Mom," he said, and his voice had lost the practiced flatness entirely. It was the voice of a man who had been genuinely shaken by something and had not yet finished being shaken. "We saw everything. The video, the news coverage, all of it. We need to talk about what we did." Constance looked at her 3 children standing in the doorway of her mother's attic room and felt the complicated weight of 44 years of unjust suffering and 3 weeks of fresh abandonment pressing simultaneously against something older and more fundamental. The simple, stubborn fact that she had loved these 3 people since before they existed and had never fully stopped. "Come in," she said. "Sit down." They sat on the floor, all 3 of them, in the dusty attic room, and for the first time in longer than any of them could accurately remember, they talked without performance or defensiveness or the careful management of guilt. Warren spoke first and at length about choices he had made and the reasons he had made them, and his growing understanding that reasons were not the same as justifications. Diane cried for the first 20 minutes, and then stopped crying and spoke very directly about the shame she felt. Not the shame of being seen on the news as a daughter who had failed her mother, but the deeper shame of understanding that she had known, somewhere beneath all her practical reasoning, that what she was doing was wrong and had done it anyway. Clifton said the least, but what he said was the most precise. He said that he had grown up hearing whispers about his mother's past and had never fully believed her version of events and had carried a low-level embarrassment about her for most of his adult life. And that understanding now that she had been telling the truth the entire time meant confronting not just what he had done 3 weeks ago, but what he had been doing in smaller and less visible ways for decades. A lawyer named Theodore Wynn contacted her on Thursday. He had seen the coverage, he explained, and wanted to offer his services pro bono because the case had moved him and because he believed there was a legitimate legal path worth pursuing. He laid out the situation carefully. Raymond Stokes had made false public statements that had directly damaged her professional reputation and her social standing over a period of 44 years. The documented evidence was exceptionally strong. The public admission was on video and had been widely distributed. There was, he said, a very solid civil case for defamation and economic harm. Constance thought about it overnight, weighing principle against practicality with the careful honesty of a woman who had learned that idealism was a luxury that required a financial floor beneath it. File it, she told Theodore Wynn on Friday morning. The settlement came 6 weeks after Theodore Wynn filed the case. Raymond Stokes did not fight it. His lawyers had apparently assessed the situation with the cold pragmatism of people who understood that a public admission on video, combined with 2 documented witness letters and a formal statement from the town council, left their client with no viable path to a successful defense. They negotiated efficiently and without drama, and the amount they agreed to was not extravagant, but it was enough. Enough to buy a small house outright. Enough to live on comfortably for the rest of her life without the constant background arithmetic of someone calculating whether they can afford both groceries and the electricity bill. Enough to leave something meaningful behind for the grandchildren who had reached out to her after the truth emerged, including Warren's youngest daughter, Clara, who had sent her a handwritten note on lined notebook paper that said simply, "Great-Grandma, I think you are the bravest person I have ever heard of. I hope I can meet you properly someday." Constance had read that note 4 times and kept it folded in her coat pocket next to the place where the brass key had lived for 44 years. She bought a cottage on the western edge of Dunmore Falls, a modest place with 2 bedrooms and a deep front porch and a south-facing garden space that received good light from mid-morning through late afternoon. It was not grand. It was not impressive. It was exactly what she wanted, which was a place that was genuinely and legally hers, where she could close the door and know that no landlord's son in Nashville could sell it out from under her, where she could plant roses in the spring and sit on the porch in the evenings and feel, in a simple fact of ownership, a security she had not experienced since before Arthur died. She set up her sewing room in the 2nd bedroom immediately, arranging her machine and her tools and her thread collection with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this many times in many different spaces. She put a small advertisement in the Dunmore Falls community newsletter offering alterations and custom work. The response was more than she could have anticipated. People came with garments and apologies in roughly equal measure. Some of them women who had withdrawn their business from her 44 years ago and wanted now to give it back. Some of them younger people who had simply heard her story and wanted to be part of whatever came next for her. She accepted the business from all of them and the apologies from some of them, using a calculus that was entirely her own and that she did not feel obligated to explain to anyone. The wedding dress, she had Lillian's trunk professionally cleaned and the dress itself treated by a textile conservator in Nashville who worked with historical garments and understood how to stabilize aged silk without damaging it. When it came back, it was mounted in a deep archival frame behind UV protective glass, the ivory fabric bright against the dark backing, the lace at the collar as delicate and precise as the day she had stitched it. She hung it on the wall of her front room, above the small writing desk where she kept her correspondence, where she would see it every morning when she came downstairs, not as a monument to what had been taken, as a record of what had been reclaimed. She was 80 years old when Clara came to visit for the first time, brought by Diane on a Saturday morning in early spring, 6 months after the confrontation in the community hall. Clara was 9, with serious brown eyes and the particular quality of attention that some children possess that makes you feel genuinely seen when they look at you. She stood in the front room and looked at the dress on the wall for a long time without speaking. And then she turned to Constance and asked, with the direct simplicity of a child who has not yet learned to soften questions, "Is that the dress from the story?" "It is," Constance said. "Did it feel scary?" Clara asked, standing up in front of all those people. Constance considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "It felt necessary," she said finally. "Sometimes the things that feel necessary and the things that feel scary are exactly the same thing. And you have to decide which feeling gets to be in charge." Clara thought about this for a moment with visible concentration. "Can you teach me to sew?" she asked. Constance looked at her great-granddaughter, at those serious brown eyes, at the open and uncomplicated trust in her expression that had not yet been complicated by the accumulated disappointments of adult life, and felt something move through her chest that was warm and uncomplicated and real. Clara listened to all of it with the dress needle moving steadily in her small hands. And when Constance finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "So great-great-grandma Lillian saved you even after she was gone." "Yes," Constance said. "She did. I want to be like that," Clara said simply. "I want to be someone who saves people even after." Constance looked at her great-granddaughter and felt 44 years of unjust suffering sit quietly beside the present moment without overwhelming it, which was perhaps the closest thing to peace that a person could reasonably expect from a life as long and as complicated as hers had been. "You already are," she said. "You just have to keep choosing it." Outside the window, the spring garden was beginning. The roses she had planted along the south fence 3 weeks earlier were showing their first tentative leaves, small and bright green, and entirely committed to the business of becoming what they were meant to be. The afternoon light fell across the sewing room floor in long, warm rectangles. The dress hung on the wall in the front room, preserved and framed and permanent. The truth had waited 44 years. It had arrived exactly when it was needed. And Constance Hargrove, who had been evicted at 79 with nothing but a suitcase and a dying promise, who had climbed a weathered staircase in October with no idea what waited for her at the top, who had stood alone in front of 150 people and said the thing that needed to be said, Constance Hargrove was home. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.